Next, we have John Droz Jr. online, independent physicist, done a great job. His entire focus is the 3 E's: energy, environment, and importantly, education. Everybody, politicians to middle school. He's got an informal coalition of some 10,000 individuals and 700 PhDs, so maybe John can push a couple buttons. But I think we need a groundswell because we're going to have climate in the next debate between Vice President Pence and Kamala. And then I think we're probably going to have it twice in the remaining 2 debates. John Kerry's been pressing to get climate into the debate, and Chris Wallace accommodated. But John Droz has his own website. It's called wiseenergy.org. Also publishes a periodic energy and environmental newsletter, very helpful because he pulls some stuff out from COVID to climate science to energy, whatever, very useful. And he basically has a philosophy that says, science exists to give us answers to our technical problems. As such, our technical policies should be based on real science. So John, look forward to hearing from you to talk about critically thinking about climate change.
Okay, thank you for the kind introduction. I appreciate TRCS for their inviting me to be a part of this esteemed collection of presenters, and particularly Jim Peacock, who made the arrangements for me to speak today. I really appreciate this opportunity. This is going to be like speed dating, so please take notes as we go along, and I'll try to answer any questions you have at the end. Everyone else's mic should be muted now, so if you have any questions, please post them on the chat board, and I'll address as many as time permits at the end. Based on recently adjudicated verdicts by the Court of Public Opinion, I'm obligated to give you a fair notice that what follows is politically incorrect. Again, my topic today is critically thinking about climate change, one of the most important issues of our times. I like this quote from Mark Twain, who had a wealth of other good insights and witty sayings. This observation applies to climate change in spades. So I'm aware that I'm taking on a near impossible task here, tackling a very complex technical topic that has extraordinary implications in our lives, with an audience having a wide range of scientific expertise. Furthermore, we have to overcome an enormous amount of misinformation that has been widely propagated. And if that wasn't enough, all this in 30 minutes or so. Churchill's another person I love to quote, as his humorous comments are always spot on. Like this one. JFK has also had some fine quotes, and this one hits the bullseye. The great enemy of truth is not often the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often, we hold fast to cliches. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. Oh my God, is that spot on or what? I'm interested in improving communication. So it's one of the questions that answers I'm giving to Tom Moser, for instance, about how we succeed here with our representatives. So today I'm going to talk about climate change from a perspective that, to my knowledge, has never been done anywhere else in the world. Some might say that I have unrealistic expectations considering the limited time we have. However, I'm an optimist and I think we can do it. We'll see. I'm going to tackle this challenge in 6 quickie parts. A minute or so about me, for those who don't know that much about me, a brief overview of what science actually is, an explanation of a basic way of solving everyday problems that I call 4S, an advanced way of solving problems that I call 4S plus critical thinking, number 5, applying critical thinking to climate change, and lastly, some conclusions about climate change. So here we go. Part 1, who is the man behind the screen? Super short story is that I'm a scientist, physicist, and not really a public speaker, so I'm a bit out of my element here. I'm an upstate New York native and still have a summer home at Branningham Lake in the Adirondacks. That's where I'm coming to you from as we speak. FYI, my primary home is in coastal North Carolina, across the street from a nice golf course and on the Intercoastal Waterway. I received degrees in both physics and math from Boston College, and then a graduate degree in physics from Syracuse University. I worked for a few high-tech companies and then retired from a management job at General Electric in Utica, New York at age 34. How I did that? Well, that's another interesting story for another time. The condensed version of what happened in the 40 years since, I'm now 74, is that I decided to become a citizen advocate and to focus on what I call the 3 E's: energy, environment, and education. May not be apparent, but these 3 items are very interrelated. My science and grassroots background give me a perspective on these issues that is relatively rare. So I've probably given over 100 free talks. By the way, just to be clear, no one has paid me a dime for any of this work, just like I'm talking with you today, gratis. The downside of providing these free services is that I've been targeted by lobbyists, NGOs, etc., whose apple cart I've upset. For example, here's a major study done by the National Sierra Club about who they say is responsible for slowing down the implementation of renewable energy in the United States. After about 20 pages of malarkey, they concluded that the 2 major culprits in the United States are the Koch brothers and me. Who would have known? The Koch brothers funded organizations while I provided information. My takeaway is that this proves that education is as important as handing out money. Think about that. Here's another major report, this time from the Scientific American. The background about how this article came about is quite revealing, but again, we don't have enough time to go into that unless you want to cover it during the Q&A. Yet another example is a peer-reviewed study about me and some of my successful efforts in North Carolina. Again, the backstory here is really amazing. Lastly, I was honored to be included in this well-known picture that's supposed to be me on the right. Just to show how these sources can play fast and free with the truth, I've never smoked in my life and I'm exclusively a beer drinker. But why let the facts spoil a good story? Okay, that's all about me. A few words about science. Starting point in many of my talks is a brief discussion about science. To begin with, understanding the words we use is very important. For example, I can tell you that one of the first things our opponents try to do is to corrupt the language. A good example is the phrase wind farm. There is no such thing, as the only thing farmed is subsidies. I refuse to use that phrase, and I tell wind promoters that I'll say, quote, wind farm, once they start calling nuclear facilities an atom farm. So, does the public really understand what this common word science actually means? I think not. There's a fascinating dichotomy going on here. The vast majority of citizens think well of science, yet very few people can give a concise definition of what science actually is. That discrepancy is repeatedly taken advantage of by self-serving lobbyists. Many marketers claim that their product is, quote, science-based, even though it's not. These promoters are counting on the fact that 99% of the public has little idea what science really is, so their false claims are unlikely to be seriously challenged. That this study came across mostly false science claims every 10 minutes is really telling. So let's cut to the chase. What is science? Well, the clothes you're wearing, the food you ate today, the transportation vehicle, the building you're in, the lights in the ceiling, the computers we're using here, etc., all come from scientific discoveries. These are based on many generations of scientists using logic and deductive reasoning, carrying out observations and measurements, formulating and then testing hypotheses and theories. When asked to define science, most people think of theorems and equations, but that is not science. This observation is spot on. Science is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge. Our species needs and deserves a citizenry with minds wide awake and with a basic understanding of how the world works, unquote. The term science comes from the Latin word scientia, which means knowledge. The question is, how do we obtain knowledge in technical areas? Over thousands of years, we have worked out a methodology for discovering the technical truths of our universe. That is what the field of science is all about. Science is a process. The understanding that science is a process is critically important for our evaluating claims that are supposedly based on science, like climate change. The question always is, did they follow the process? Today, we are overwhelmed by charlatans making many fake news claims about what's scientific. Science without the proper process is not science. Call it whatever you want. Political science, pseudoscience, junk science, astrology, etc. But it is not true science. As it says and depicts here, science is the enemy of con artists, scammers, lobbyists, and other self-serving promoters. Okay, so what is the scientific process? These are the four basic elements. When advocates propose some supposed technical solution, let's say like industrial wind energy, our response should be very simple. Show me where a genuine scientific assessment has been made of your claims. Using these four criteria, it will be very apparent whether you're dealing with science or snake oil. By the way, no such scientific assessment has ever been done that proves all the claims made by wind advocates. Good question is, who has the obligation for going through this process? The answer is that when a new hypothesis or product is proposed as a potential solution to a technical problem, it's up to the promoters to provide the scientific assessment that proves its veracity. It's not the obligation of others to disprove their hypothesis or to provide a better one. Okay, one more important science explanation pertinent to our topic today. We often hear the phrase global warming theory. Is that accurate? Is that another lobbyist deception? Make a guess. In most things in life, we are instinctively interested in certainty. But can science give us certainty? This quote says it accurately. Science has its weaknesses, and it doesn't have a stranglehold on the truth. However, science has a way of approaching technical issues that is a closer approximation of truth than any other method we have. Here's an important graphical representation of the steps taken in science as it tries to proceed to certainty. This is important. Question of our topic today is, where do we stand on these steps regarding the climate change matter? I think any competent objective analysis would conclude that we are at the hypothesis level. So the use of the term theory is deceptive. Big surprise. I think this quote is prophetic. We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. This is a prescription for disaster. We might get away with it for a while, but sooner or later, this combustible mixture of ignorance and power is going to blow up in our faces. Okay, hopefully you know enough about science that we can proceed. Part 3, the next piece of the puzzle we need to have is knowledge about how we go about solving problems in general, everyday problems. Everyone here has had to deal with thousands of problems. That's life, which is really a series of one challenge after the other. Whether we did it consciously or not, we all develop a methodology for dealing with our everyday problems. I'm going to simplify things here and say that your problem-solving methodology will likely fall into one of these three general categories. Surprisingly, or maybe not, inaction when facing a problem is actually the most common strategy used by most people. Well, why is that? Here are some explanations. You don't know what to do with the problem you're faced with. You believe the problem will go away by itself. You hope that someone else will take care of the issue. After reflection, you decide that the problem is not such a big deal. You think that it's more trouble addressing it than it's worth. You figure that there's nothing you can do to fix it. And of course, it may be you're just a procrastinator. The next level up, I'm calling the basic 4S problem-solving approach. Here are the 4 S's of this problem-solving strategy: source, severity, solution, and substantiation. Let's do an example. Let's say you have a real estate business and it's not doing as well as you'd like it to. The basic 4S problem-solving methodology here is that you would try to have an honest answer to each of the 4 S's. So, you decide that the problem source is that there aren't enough sales. You then assess the severity as not being catastrophic, but moderate. After considering several options, you decide that the most appropriate solution is to provide better sales training to your agents. Finally, you look at the results, sales, to substantiate the appropriateness of your chosen solution. If results aren't good, then you try something else. That's a quick example of how a basic problem-solving approach works. Next, since we're dealing with a complicated matter, climate change, let's briefly review an advanced problem-solving approach. Essentially, the advanced problem-solving approach adds critical thinking to the basic 4S methodology. What is critical thinking? It means that we analyze a problem more objectively, more broadly, and more deeply. Here's an explanation of each of those three terms. These are some of the opposites of critical thinking, and we see a lot of these on topics like climate change, wind energy, etc. By the way, confirmation bias means that we investigate something with our mind already made up and then just look for things that support our initial belief. That is not science. So the upgraded 4S solving process with a critical thinking still uses the same basic ingredients, but it does use them more objectively, more broadly, and more deeply. Okay, now we've got a quickie review. See, we're moving along here, how we solve tougher problems. Let's apply this knowledge to climate change. There's the crux of what we're here to talk about today. Here's the climate change situation spelled out with a 4S methodology. The proponents' claims are that the climate change source is CO2. The climate change severity is extreme. The climate change solution is things like wind energy. And they say that they have proven results to substantiate all of this. So, if citizens, scientists, legislators said want to determine the legitimacy of the climate change story, then the most effective way to really do that is to critically analyze all four of these elements for its veracity. So all this preliminary talk is leading up to what we're here to do today. As the slide says, I wrote 3 different reports, each one specifically addressing one of the first 3 problem-solving elements. Obviously, you don't have the time to go through all of them today, so I'm showing you 2 places where you can easily get these reports so that you can then carefully review them at your leisure. Website and my newsletters. It may not be immediately apparent, but I put a lot of effort into making these reports to be citizen-friendly. In other words, they are not designed just for academics. They are short, logical, understandable, interesting, and scientifically sound. Here's what the cover of the first report looks like. The defense of CO2 investigates the claim that CO2 is the source of climate change. This report examines 15 different key assertions about CO2 made by climate change advocates. The takeaway from this report is that every claim is shown to be suspect. Note, this just isn't my opinion, as multiple scientific studies are cited for each of the 15 critiques. Amazingly, over 250 studies from independent experts are cited in this one report. We don't have the time to go through all 15 today, so let's just look at one simpler example. This is one of the 15. The United Nations Climate Change Agency, the IPCC, says that the residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere is over 100 years. By the way, I'm assuming here you know who the IPCC is and the major role they play in the climate change matter. If you don't, then my second report has much more information about the IPCC. Why is this matter important? Well, residence time basically means how long newly generated CO2, for example, from fossil fuels, stays in the atmosphere before breaking up, going in outer space, absorbed in the oceans, etc. If the residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere is, in fact, as they say, IPCC says, over 100 years, that means, assuming that CO2 is actually bad, it's extremely urgent to stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere immediately because all new CO2 we generate will stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, over 100 years. Let's compare what the IPCC says to what independent scientists have concluded about atmospheric CO2 residence time. Here's a graphic representation of what 36 peer-reviewed studies, hear that part? Peer-reviewed studies said about atmospheric CO2 residence time. Their average conclusion was that the atmospheric CO2 residence time is less than 10 years. That's a profoundly different result from what the IPCC says. Here's a recent peer-reviewed study, that concluded that the average CO2 residence time is about 4 years. These 37 peer-reviewed studies are saying that a key alarmist claim about CO2 is likely false. If these scientists are right, it means that the new CO2 gets out of the atmosphere much quicker than the alarmists at the IPCC are saying, which means the climate change situation is much less dire than they say as well. So if you download this report from links I showed you and go through all 15 rebuttals, I think you see that there is considerable evidence that indicates that CO2 is nowhere near the culprit that climate change alarmists are making it out to be. The result is I'm putting a big question mark after the source of climate change. Next, here's the cover of the second report. The 4 Pillars of Climate Change takes a deep dive look into 4 sources of authority that are the most common referenced to support climate change concerns. They are the IPCC, which we've already mentioned, the supposed 97% consensus of scientists, computer models, and extreme weather events. If you talk to anybody, you say, why do you believe in climate change? They're going to say likely one of these 4 things, one or more. Again, because we're time limited today, we're just going to look at one of these 4 pillars, computer modeling, to see how solid a support it really is. Slides I'm going to show you now are part of a more detailed analysis I put together, which actually explains 8, get that, 8 different reasons why computer models for climate change is highly suspect. The link for that full computer modeling critique is in the second report. You need to give some critical thinking to this query. Are computer models appropriate or accurate for climate change? The answer to this boils down to answering 2 important questions. How accurate are computer models, number 1, for an extremely complex situation, and number 2, for a long time into the future? I'm a believer in simplifying things. In this case, we can answer those 2 important questions by looking at the accuracy of computer models for moderately complex short-term matters. In other words, as it says on the slide, if computer models for moderately complex short-term matters are reliably very accurate, then maybe we can extrapolate that success into creating computer models for more complex, longer-term matters. However, if they are not, these moderately complex short-term matters are not very accurate, then it makes no sense to assume that a more complex, longer-term matter can be accurately modeled. We're going to look at hurricanes, as tracking hurricanes is an outstanding test of a computer's ability to accurately model a moderately complex, short-term scenario. Additionally, it's a good test because due to the major life and death consequences of accurately knowing a hurricane's path, a significant amount of time, effort, research, expertise, and money has been expended in creating accurate computer models for this situation. Also, due to the enormous impacts, these computer models are run on the most powerful computer hardware we have. And lastly, this is a very short-term situation, so we will know the accuracy of the model within a few days. We don't have to wait any 50 years. So let's look at a recent major U.S. hurricane and see how accurate computer models were for this moderately complex short-term scenario. Hurricane Matthew is used as an example. This is a rare, extremely strong Category 5 hurricane, so it was given a lot of attention. Here are some of the sample headlines about it. So here we go. This first picture is early in the process where Matthew just got to hurricane status. The first thing to note is how they did not have high confidence in any of their specific models, so they show 6 different models. That should tell you something. Point number 2 is that none of the 6 models agree with each other. That should tell you something. Point number 3 is that 9 days in advance of making U.S. landfall, not one of these 6 powerful models was accurate. Note, the light green track is actually what took place. So let's look what happened every 2 days going forward here now. This is 2 days later. First one was 9 days. This is 7 days before U.S. landfall. Still, not one of these 6 powerful computer models was correct. Even close to being correct. This is 2 days further on. Now 5 days before U.S. landfall. Still, not one of these computer models was even remotely close. Not one. This snapshot is now 3 days before U.S. landfall. Just look at these. This is almost humorous. Amazingly, not one of these computer models is even remotely accurate 3 days before landfall. Here we are 1 day in advance of official landfall, and for the first time, oh my goodness, one model that our glue on is now correct. Just think about it. 1 day before official landfall, 5 out of 6 models are very wrong. Let's look at how they go off south and so forth. Oh my goodness. This last snapshot is 2 additional days further on, 1 day after U.S. landfall. Astoundingly, the one earlier correct model, dark blue, is now back to being wrong again. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. So to review, this is the full actual path taken by Hurricane Matthew. What I hope you understand from the evidence I'm showing you, not my opinion, these are facts, is that not a single one of the 6 top computer models is even remotely accurate anytime throughout the whole process, ever. Bottom line is that despite spending a significant amount of time, effort, research, expertise, and the money on modeling, and despite running these models on the most powerful computer hardware in the planet, the inescapable conclusion is that our computer modeling is not a proven, reliable methodology for getting an accurate projection of even a moderately complex short-term scenario. We don't have to be Einstein to figure out that for a highly complex, long-term scenario, that the accuracy and reliability of computer models would be orders of magnitude less. As I mentioned earlier, the major fault at Dix's plan is just one of 8 serious deficiencies in computer models. This is not our total case. This is one of 8. So to see the other 7 problems, go check out the link in my slide for my slideshow in the 4 pillars report. Here's an insightful Dilbert strip about computer models. Here's another. So the bottom line about computer models is that we all have an innate interest in the future. The popularity of horoscopes to palm readers attest to this predisposition. Who doesn't want to know what will happen tomorrow? Who doesn't want to be prepared for problematic future situations? We all do. That said, there's no gene or the human ability we have to be able to reliably forecast the future. None. Zip. Nada. We can make powerful machines, but they all are restricted by human limitations. For example, every climate computer model is entirely dependent on humans accurately identifying all of the variables involved and then accurately specifying the role of each of these variables plays and then accurately defining all the interrelationships of these variables. Since there are enormous gaps in our understanding of climate change, all such computer models are no more reliable than consulting a fortune teller. What this means, when we do critical thinking about the second element of our problem-solving methodology, severity, which is based on computer models, is that it comes up highly suspect. We're getting close to the end here now. Here's the cover of the 3rd report. Taking the wind out of climate change takes a hard look at one of the main solutions proposed by climate change advocates. For example, Joe Biden's recent outline of his climate change plan, if he gets elected, includes a provision for at least 10,000 industrial wind turbines in the U.S. 10,000. This report does some critical thinking analysis about industrial wind energy. In fact, it examines wind from 5 unique perspectives. Read it. Some startling findings that are documented are that A, there are no scientific studies anywhere in the world proving that wind saves a consequential amount of CO2. None. And B, there are scientific studies concluded that wind can make global warming worse. And C, there's a real kicker, there are scientific studies concluding that gas can save more CO2 than wind. Now, these are technical matters. Can't really have time to go into them right now, but the report explains them all. How many of those facts have you seen in the mainstream media? To examine the studies behind these findings, please read this third report. So our critical thinking examination here says that the solution part of the problem-solving methodology is also highly suspect. Big surprise. This brings us to the fourth and last element of the problem-solving strategy, substantiation. So how will climate change proponents rationalize it if the substantiation part of the problem-solving methodology undermines their entire case? The evidence I've shown you says that all the prior three items are suspect, so that is almost certain to happen. Well, the alarmists are acutely aware of how embarrassing that would be, so they have painstakingly avoided any meaningful substantiation. Take one of the leading alarmist states, New York. Even though New York State repeatedly claims that the world's survival is in the balance, they are not doing any real substantiation of the results of their climate change policies. It's all based on faith and the claims of salespeople. For example, New York State does not accurately show the real CO2 consequences of industrial wind projects. To justify their political choice, they make inappropriate comparisons like wind versus coal instead of real-world comparisons more appropriate today. Also, New York State does not require industrial wind developers to prove how much CO2 they are actually saving. Why not? The world's at stake. This is like three-card monte. Citizens think they know where the ball really is, but they have no idea whatsoever. The not surprising result from the fourth problem-solving element is that there is no proven substantiation of their climate case. So we're almost done. This is the overview of how well the climate change story holds up under a critical thinking analysis when examining it with a proven problem-solving technique. In my view, these are two great insights that apply to the climate change story. So I've alerted you to three good reports, each one exposing weaknesses of the first three parts of the problem-solving methodology when applied to climate change. There is no fourth report, so we can't discuss what doesn't exist. Substantiation of the first three parts. So you can draw your own conclusions from our brief analysis today, but these are mine. Number one, climate change proponents have not adhered to the four elements of the scientific process: objective, comprehensive, transparent, and empirical. Not done. Number two, presently climate change is a scientific hypothesis, not a theory. Number three, what that means is that climate change is unequivocally not scientifically resolved matter. That's the nature of hypothesis. Four, there is no imminent existential threat in the foreseeable future. Five, there are strong indications that this is not about climate, but rather about undisclosed objectives like world governance. Six, false climate solutions like wind and solar are being foisted on us by self-serving parties with economic and political interests. Despite all these shortcomings, my personal belief is that we should address what's called quote-unquote climate change by making common sense decisions. For example, we ought to support nuclear power. Put another way, we are witnessing an epic battle between science and political science. Whichever is the winner will have an incomprehensible impact on our economy, our society, and our freedoms. Again, there's much more on my website, wiseenergy.org. Make sure to read the three reports that are all on the global warming page. If you email me, I'll sign you up for our free monthly energy and environmental newsletter, which currently has over 10,000 subscribers worldwide. So that's it. Thank you for your patience and attention to hearing my concerns as a scientist and a citizen. Nothing else. I hope this information has gotten you thinking. I'll now answer some questions that are in the chat box, etc. I'll also be glad to answer any future questions that come up if you email me.
I have a question about your presentation. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Is the title that you gave for the presentation on your website?
You mean, is there a PDF on my website for?
Yeah, is your presentation that you gave here today on your website? Are the slides there or
I
PDF
just
in
did this
form?
for this group here. So no, it isn't at this point. But I will put together a PDF copy of it, but it doesn't have my words, unfortunately. I can show you the slides, but it won't have the words.
Yeah, because it's an excellent presentation on methodology. I've been keen on methodology for years. There's a guy at University of Pennsylvania, Scott Armstrong, who has also done
Yeah.
a lot of work on methodology, and he has his criteria, and he points out that the people who are pushing dangerous climate change have not satisfied a good portion of that criteria. But your presentation was very good. I much appreciate it. I'd like to get at least the PDFs from it.
Sure, Lloyd. Glad to do that. Okay, I'm going through the chat box if there's anyone else. Thank you, Tom. Vice Miller.
A little bit, John, this is Randy.
Yes, Randy.
You've done a lot of work on sea level rise, and you were very effective in kind of pushing back on the North Carolina assumption that woe is us, we have to deal with sea level rise.
Yeah.
What was the most effective argument or presentation that you used to deal with that? Because that's a common issue down along the Gulf Coast.
Well, that's one of the studies I referred to. Let me tell you what they said. So lots of times it's what your opponent says that may be of interest, right? Can you see this?
Yep.
Okay. This is a peer-reviewed study. Okay, I'm going to keep remembering and emphasize that because peer review is what people are saying is the gold standard. This is a peer-reviewed study that was done about my success at getting sea level rise legislation passed in North Carolina. Okay, so what the fight was about basically was that there were activists like Oceana, Sierra Club, et cetera. They were going along the coastal communities of North Carolina and trying to get them to pass alarmist, what I would call alarmist legislation pertaining to sea level rise. It's a long story, but that's the gist of it, okay? And my county was approached about it because I'm in sort of the middle of the coastal area, Carteret County, right in the middle of the coast of North Carolina. And the first thing that was good was that actually my county commissioners had enough respect for me is that they called me up and they told me about this meeting that they had with the state and these other people. And they said, this is what they're telling us to do, that we have to change our rules. We have to raise bridges. We have to raise roadways, all sorts of things. They were pretty extremist matters. And their question to me was, do you think this makes sense? Well, that was great that they asked me. So I started getting involved in it much more because of that. And the bottom line was I went to the state legislators and I gave a couple of talks to state legislators. I enabled some allies that were state legislators to set up these talks. And so I gave slide presentations, just like a little slide presentation I gave you now, about the realities of sea level rise. And I think that had a lot of impact. Now, what the study says is that I was clever. This is what it says, not me saying this, that I was clever in demonizing the alarmists. That's what they mean by through naming. But they said I put these people in a bad light. You know, like they don't do that to us, right? Give me a break. But the amazing thing was that this peer-reviewed study, they didn't ever talk to me. So I didn't even know about the study until it came out. So how could these people say, you know, this was an objective study about something when they never talked to me even once? They never communicated. They never emailed me. Never. No communication whatsoever. All of a sudden, I see this study coming out explaining how I was able to win this fight. But it's all made up. It's just not true. But I'm saying the bottom line was, if you want a short answer, the short answer is that I tried to develop some contacts with some key people in the state legislature. I went and met with them personally, even though for me it's a 3-hour drive to our capital. And I got them to sponsor me to put on some talks to state legislators in general. And then I also got some organizations in the state that were sympathetic, conservative organizations, to support this. You know, it was a variety of things that worked together. In fact, I did a similar thing helping Senator Campbell here in Texas to pass a bill. I think it was S-277 about protecting Texas military facilities from wind projects. So I assisted Senator Campbell about that. In fact, it was so successful that I arranged for her to speak on Tucker Carlson. And so she did have a talk on Tucker Carlson as to what happened. But anyways, I'm just an individual. So what I'm telling you is that individuals can have success here. But in my view, one of the big things that we're missing here as conservatives is we have very little understanding of public relations, very little understanding of what I would call more advanced communications, and we do a poor job of working together. That's the bottom line. We need to work together with our other allies, our other conservative groups that are allies. And we need to up our game as far as using much more sophisticated communication. That's my answer.
John, this is Greg Goodnight. Brilliant presentation. I really enjoyed it. The term I run into when studying this is it's called post-normal science. And the way I understand it, it's one of these, if we are righteous and we have the right thing, we are fully entitled to change data, to change the facts, as long as our goals are noble and we do it. And the example that's commonly given is the Steve Schneider approach, where it's you got to have the high moral ground on science, and there's no such thing as objective science. It's only what is moral in whosever interpretation. Have you run into this term and had thought about it, and what are your I can only imagine what your thinking would be, but would you care to comment on that?
Yes, PNS, in my opinion, is slightly different from how you designed it. Part of what you're saying is right. My understanding is that it's more a claim that there are multiple issues these days that are too complex for science to actually properly handle. And climate change is one of those cases. So they're saying traditional science doesn't have the tools, the abilities, et cetera, to handle an issue like climate change.
Yeah.
That's the basic contention.
I'm wondering how all this, the climate temperature history and all this data seemingly undergoes revision after revision after revision, and it's all in the same direction. They cool the past, warm the present, and Tony Heller points out, if you look at where they end up, what they're doing is using the models to say what the data should be, rather than the data to say what the models, to correct the models and fix the models. So to me, it's a very dangerous trend where people are fixing data to fit models.
Well, the problem, the trend that's bad is that they are effectively discarding traditional science. Once you've discarded traditional science as a methodology to handle these things, the question is, where do you go from there? What do you use? And so then they bring up alternative things, like saying, well, the end justifies the means, and so forth. That's part of really what climate change has actually become. And there's a fight in a parallel universe here, and that is climate change is technically a secular religion. And our traditional religions are having the same fight. Where we used to be a country based on Judeo-Christian standards, environmentalism and climate change, things like this is a secular religion that is competing, I'm not saying figuratively, but literally, for the hearts and souls of citizens here, directly with traditional Judeo-Christian organizations here. And so far, the traditional Judeo-Christian organizations are losing. because this secular religion here is really caught on. So it's a similar argument or similar problem in that our religions are being undermined, our science is being undermined. So yes.
Yeah, John, let me get a question in here. You're saying that climate change can't be solved by traditional science, but I take exception to that, and I'd like for you to point out if I'm incorrect. But
I didn't say that, Jim. I'm saying that's what these opponents are saying. I'm not saying that.
okay, well, I was going to propose that our analysis, because it's we simplified it to just deal with CO2 and temperature, was
Jim, I'm perfectly agree. I believe science is appropriate here. I was asked the question about post-normal science, what those people believe, and that's what those people believe.
okay.
Not me. I disagree with that.
Okay, thanks. I wasn't offended. I just was curious to know whether or not we met the criteria.
Science is very appropriate, very applicable to handle all climate change, in my opinion.
Uh-huh.
Thank you very much, John.
Yeah.
Great resource.